They told her Americans would torture her. They told her she would be stripped, beaten, and worse. So when Margarete Hoffmann saw the young American medic reaching toward her broken arm, she did the only thing her fear would allow. She lunged at him with her good hand, nails aimed at his eyes, screaming in German, "Don't touch me! Don't touch me!" The medic stumbled backward, blood trickling from a scratch on his cheek. But what happened next, what he did in that moment, would shatter everything she believed about the enemy. It wasn't violence. It wasn't anger. It was something far more dangerous to her hatred. May 1945. The war in Europe was dying, but Margarete didn't know that yet. She only knew pain, fear, and the echo of propaganda that had filled her ears for 12 years. She was 23 years old, a radio operator for the Wehrmacht, and now she lay in the ruins of a bombed-out German field hospital, surrounded by the enemy she had been taught to fear more than death itself. If you want to hear more incredible true stories from World War II, stories that textbooks don't tell you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These forgotten moments of history deserve to be remembered. 3 days earlier, Margarete's world had been different. Not safe, not comfortable, but at least familiar. She sat in a concrete bunker 20 kilometers from Berlin, headphones pressed against her ears, transcribing coded messages that made less and less sense as the days passed. The orders were chaos: retreat here, hold there, reinforcements that would never come, victories that existed only on paper. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary in 1943, barely 21, filled with the certainty that came from a lifetime of rallies, uniforms, and promises of greatness. Her father had been a baker in Stuttgart before the war, a quiet man who never spoke about politics, who kept his head down and his ovens warm. But Margarete had been young, impressionable, swept up in the tide of belonging that the regime offered. The uniform meant something. It meant she mattered. It meant she was part of something larger than herself. Now, in May 1945, those promises were crumbling like the concrete walls around her. The bunker shook with each artillery blast. Dust rained from the ceiling. The other girls, there were 5 of them in total, sat at their stations, faces pale, hands trembling as they tried to maintain the fiction of order. One girl, Hannah, was only 19. She cried quietly between transmissions, her shoulders shaking. Another, Elsa, chain-smoked cigarettes down to the filter, her eyes hollow and distant. The officer in charge, Lieutenant Bauer, had disappeared 2 days ago, just walked out during a shift change and never returned. No one blamed him, no one even mentioned it. They all understood the same thing. This was the end. The Reich was broken. The 1,000-year empire had lasted 12. On the 3rd day, the shelling got closer. Much closer. The lights went out. The radio equipment sparked and died, and then came voices in the darkness above them, shouting in a language that sent ice through Margaret's veins. English. American English. She had heard it before in propaganda films, in the crude caricatures of enemy soldiers they had been shown in training. The accent was unmistakable. "We have to surrender," Elsa whispered in the darkness. Her cigarette glowed briefly, illuminating her gaunt face. "There's no other way." "No." Margaret's voice was sharp. "You know what they do to women. You've heard the stories." She had heard them. They all had. Stories whispered in barracks, printed in desperate last leaflets, told by soldiers retreating from the front. The Americans and British were civilized compared to the Soviets, yes, but they were still the enemy. Still dangerous, still men who had been fighting for years and who would want revenge. The propaganda had been specific. Capture meant degradation. Torture, worse. Better to die with dignity than fall into their hands. But when the bunker door burst open and flashlight beams cut through the darkness, there was no time for dignity. Margarete ran. She didn't think, just moved, pushing past Hannah toward a service tunnel at the back of the bunker. Behind her, she heard shouts in English, footsteps on concrete, Hannah screaming. Margarete didn't look back. Terror drove her forward through the narrow tunnel, hands scraping against rough walls, lungs burning. She emerged into daylight, gray, smoke-filled, but still daylight. The field hospital was ahead, a cluster of damaged buildings that had once been a school. She had been there before, delivering messages. It seemed like safety, like somewhere to hide. She ran across open ground, hearing the whistle of incoming shells, the crack of rifle fire in the distance. Her boots slipped on mud and debris. Halfway across the field, the world exploded. She didn't hear the shell that hit near her. One moment she was running, the next she was on the ground, ears ringing, left arm screaming with pain. She tried to move it and almost blacked out. Broken. Definitely broken. Blood soaked through her sleeve. She crawled the rest of the way to the hospital, dragging herself through mud, tasting copper and smoke. Inside the hospital, chaos reigned. Wounded soldiers lay on every surface. Floors, tables, benches. The doctors were gone. Most of the nurses were gone. Only a few remained, overwhelmed, moving between patients with supplies that had run out days ago. Margarete collapsed in a corner, cradling her broken arm, trying not to scream. A nurse, an older woman with kind eyes and blood-stained hands, gave her a brief look, shook her head, and moved on to someone who might actually survive. Margarete lay there for hours, or maybe days. Time became fluid, marked only by waves of pain and the sounds of battle drawing closer. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind mixing memories with delirium. She saw her father's bakery, smelled fresh bread, saw her mother hanging laundry in their small garden, saw her brother Hans in his SS uniform, home on leave in 1943, proud and certain. Hans was dead now, killed near Stalingrad. Her mother had received the letter 2 years ago and never quite recovered. When Margarete opened her eyes again, the sounds were different. English voices, boots on broken glass, American soldiers moving through the hospital, securing the building. She tried to make herself smaller in her corner, pressing against the wall despite the agony in her arm. Fear flooded her system, drowning out even the pain. This was it. This was what she had been warned about. A shadow fell over her. She looked up to see an American soldier, young, maybe 25, with a Red Cross armband marking him as a medic. He had brown eyes, a tired face, and he was holding a medical bag. He knelt down slowly, hands visible, and said something in English. His tone was gentle, but she didn't understand the words. All she understood was that he was the enemy, and he was reaching for her. Everything they had told her came flooding back. Every warning, every story, every piece of propaganda. This was the moment. This was where it would happen. She saw his hand coming toward her broken arm, and something primal took over. She lunged. "Don't touch me," she screamed in German, her good hand reaching for his face, nails extended. "Stay away from me! Don't touch me!" Her fingers caught his cheek, drawing blood. The medic fell backward, more from surprise than force, landing hard on the debris-covered floor. Margarete tried to stand, to run, but her broken arm made movement impossible. Pain whited out her vision. She collapsed back against the wall, sobbing, still screaming. "Don't touch me! Don't touch me!" Other soldiers rushed over. She heard sharp commands in English, saw rifles pointed in her direction. This was it. They would shoot her now. Part of her almost welcomed it. Better a bullet than what she imagined would come next. She closed her eyes, still crying, waiting for the shot. It didn't come. Instead, she heard the medic's voice, calm, steady, speaking to the other soldiers. The rifles lowered. Footsteps moved away. When she opened her eyes, the medic was still there, sitting a few feet away from her now, not approaching. Blood trickled down his cheek from the scratch she had given him. He dabbed at it with a handkerchief, wincing slightly. Then he looked at her, really looked at her, and his expression held no anger, no violence, just concern. He set down his medical bag between them, slowly, deliberately. Then he opened it, showing her the contents: bandages, morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, medical scissors. He pointed to each item, saying words in English she didn't understand, but his meaning was clear. "I'm here to help, not to hurt." Margarete shook her head violently, pressing harder against the wall. "No," she said in German. "No, you're lying. This is a trick." She had been told about this too. How they would seem kind at first, how they would lower your guard before they struck. She wouldn't fall for it, couldn't fall for it. The medic held up his hands, showing he was unarmed. He said something else in English, his voice soft, almost apologetic. Then he did something that stopped her spiraling thoughts cold. He reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, carefully, and pulled out a photograph. He held it out to her, not moving closer, letting her see it from where she sat. It was a family photo. A woman, pretty and smiling, standing in front of a white house. 2 children, a boy and a girl, maybe 6 and 8 years old, grinning at the camera. Behind them, trees heavy with autumn leaves. The woman had her arms around the children. They looked happy, safe, loved. The medic pointed to the woman, then to himself. "Wife," he said in heavily accented German. He pointed to the children. "Son, daughter." He tapped his chest. "David. My name, David." Then he pointed to her and raised his eyebrows in question. Margarete stared at the photograph, at the woman's smile, at the children's innocent faces, at the house with its neat lawn and bright windows. This was the enemy? This man with a wife and children who missed him? This man who carried their picture into war, who showed it to a woman who had just attacked him? Something cracked in her chest. Not her hatred. That was too deeply rooted to break so easily. But something else. A tiny fissure in the wall of certainty that had held her beliefs together. She looked at his face, really looked at it for the first time, saw the exhaustion there, the sadness, the scratch she had given him, still bleeding slightly. He was young, tired, human. "Margarete," she whispered finally. Her voice was hoarse from screaming. "My name is Margarete." David, the medic, smiled slightly. "Margarete," he repeated carefully. Then he pointed to her broken arm, to the blood soaking her sleeve. He mimed pain, wincing in sympathy. Then he pointed to his medical supplies and raised his eyebrows again. "May I?" She hesitated for a long moment. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to protect herself, to maintain the wall between enemy and enemy, but her arm was agony. The bone was broken badly. She could feel the unnatural angle, the grinding sensation when she moved even slightly. Without help, infection would set in. She might lose the arm, might die. And this man, this enemy, had shown her his family, had sat patiently after she attacked him, had weapons but hadn't used them, had power but hadn't abused it. Slowly, trembling, she nodded. David moved closer, inch by inch, watching her face for signs of panic. When he was near enough to reach her arm, he stopped. He showed her the morphine syrette first, miming an injection. Margarete had seen them before. German medics used similar ones. She nodded, understanding. He was asking permission, still asking, even though he had every right to simply take control. The injection was quick, professional. Within minutes, the sharp edge of pain dulled to something manageable. David worked carefully, cutting away her blood-soaked sleeve to expose the broken arm. Margarete forced herself to watch, forced herself not to flinch away. The arm was bad. Even she could see that. The bone had broken through the skin in one place, white against red. David's expression tightened, but he didn't hesitate. He cleaned the wound with a gentleness that surprised her. His hands were steady, confident, but not rough. He murmured in English as he worked, probably explaining what he was doing, though she couldn't understand the words. The tone was soothing, medical. The same tone her own doctors might have used. He applied sulfa powder to prevent infection, then began the delicate process of setting the bone. "This will hurt," he said in his broken German, meeting her eyes. "I'm sorry, but necessary." She nodded, biting her lip. When he realigned the bone, she screamed. Couldn't help it, but he held firm until the bone was straight. Then splints, bandages, careful wrapping. When he finished, her arm was immobilized, clean, properly treated, better than anything the overwhelmed German nurses could have done with their depleted supplies. David sat back, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked almost as exhausted as she felt. Then he did something else, unexpected. From his bag, he pulled out a chocolate bar, a Hershey's bar, American chocolate. He broke it in half and offered her one piece. Margarete stared at it. She hadn't seen real chocolate in 2 years. The rations had dwindled to cabbage soup and ersatz bread that tasted like sawdust. Her stomach cramped at the smell of it, sweet, rich, real. But taking it felt like betrayal, like accepting something from the enemy made her a traitor to everything she had believed. David saw her hesitation. He took a bite of his own piece, showing her it was safe, not poisoned. Then he placed her half on top of his medical bag and moved back, giving her space to choose. She waited until he looked away, treating another patient. Then quickly, almost shamefully, she grabbed the chocolate and ate it. It melted on her tongue, sweet and overwhelming. She nearly wept at the taste of it, at the betrayal of her own body's desperate gratitude. Within hours, the Americans evacuated the field hospital. The wounded who could be moved were loaded into trucks and ambulances for transport to proper medical facilities. Margarete found herself in the back of a canvas-covered truck with a dozen other German wounded, soldiers and civilians mixed together. 2 American medics rode with them, David among them. The other Germans watched the Americans with the same fear Margarete had felt. One soldier, his leg wrapped in bloody bandages, muttered constantly about what would happen to them. "They're taking us to camps," he whispered. "Work camps, or worse. You'll see. This kindness is temporary. Once we're away from witnesses." But as the truck rumbled westward through devastated German countryside, the promised cruelty never came. The medics checked on patients regularly. When someone moaned in pain, they received morphine. When an elderly man vomited from the truck's movement, they cleaned him up without complaint or disgust. When a young soldier's wound started bleeding through his bandages, they stopped the truck to redress it properly. Margarete watched all of this in confused silence. She watched David move between patients with the same gentle efficiency he had shown her. Watched him offer water to everyone, adjust bandages, speak in his limited German with a tone that held no mockery or cruelty, just tired professionalism. The landscape outside the truck was apocalyptic. Burned villages, destroyed bridges, abandoned tanks rusting in fields, refugees trudging along roadsides with everything they owned piled in carts and wheelbarrows, German civilians, defeated, homeless, starving. Margarete watched them through gaps in the canvas. These were her people. This was the fatherland she had been told to defend, and it was utterly destroyed. Yet inside the American truck, there was food, medicine, care. The contrast was dizzying, wrong. It violated everything she had been taught about who the enemy was and what defeat meant. They stopped for the night at a partially intact church. The Americans set up a temporary aid station inside. More food appeared. K-rations, canned meat, crackers, coffee, real coffee, not the acorn substitute Germans had been drinking for years. The smell of it filled the church, rich and almost painful in its normalcy. David brought Margarete a tin of stew and a canteen cup of coffee. He set them down beside her and mimed eating. "Eat," he said in German. "You need strength." Then he moved on to other patients before she could refuse or thank him. She ate alone in a corner of the church, under the watchful stone eyes of saints whose church had survived the war better than the nation around it. The stew was warm, salty, and filled with actual meat. She ate slowly, savoring each bite while simultaneously hating herself for the savoring. Around her, other German patients did the same, eating American food, accepting American medicine, beginning to realize that perhaps the monsters they had been warned about were something else entirely. That night, lying on a cot in the church with her arm throbbing despite the morphine, Margarete found she couldn't sleep. She kept seeing David's photograph, his wife and children, kept remembering the way he had sat patiently after she attacked him, showing no anger, only concern, kept tasting chocolate and coffee and shame. Near midnight, she heard quiet crying. It came from another woman, a civilian in her 40s who had been caught in the same hospital. The woman clutched a photograph of her own, 3 young boys in school uniforms, smiling at the camera. All dead now, Margarete had learned during the truck ride, killed in the bombing of Berlin. David heard the crying too. He appeared from the shadows, moving quietly between the cots. He knelt beside the woman and spoke softly in English. She didn't understand him, but she understood the kindness. He offered her a handkerchief, clean, white, American. She took it and sobbed into it while he sat with her, one hand on her shoulder, saying nothing more, just being present in her grief. Margarete watched this from across the church, watched the enemy comforting a German mother who had lost everything, and something else cracked inside her chest, wider this time, deeper. They reached the POW camp 2 days later. It was located in what had been a German military barracks before the American advance. Now it housed hundreds of German prisoners, soldiers and auxiliary personnel alike, sorted into different sections. The women's section was separate from the men's, surrounded by wire fences and guard towers, but nothing like the concentration camps Margarete had heard whispered about. This was orderly, almost clean. At the gates, the wounded were separated from the able-bodied. Margarete and others needing continued medical care were directed to the camp infirmary. David walked with them, carrying his medical bag, still their attending medic. When they reached the infirmary doors, he turned to Margarete and spoke in his careful, limited German. "Your arm will heal," he said. 6 weeks, maybe 8. The doctors here are good. They will take care of you. He paused, seeming to search for more words. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "Sorry for the war. Sorry for your pain. Sorry you were afraid." Margarete didn't know what to say. This man had saved her arm, possibly her life, had shown her kindness when she had tried to claw his eyes out, had apologized to her, the enemy, for her suffering. The words she had been taught, the responses drilled into her through years of propaganda, all felt hollow now, useless. "Thank you," she managed in German. Then carefully, in the few English words she knew from school before the war, "Thank you, David." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his tired eyes. Then he handed her something, the photograph of his family. "Keep it," he said in German. "Remember that we all have families. We all want to go home." Before she could protest or refuse, he was gone, called away to other duties. Margarete stood holding the photograph, staring at the faces of an American wife and children she would never meet, feeling the weight of what this small piece of paper represented. The infirmary was housed in a converted barracks building, clean beds with actual sheets, medical supplies stocked on shelves, American Army doctors and nurses moving efficiently between patients. Margarete was assigned a bed near a window where she could see the camp courtyard and beyond the fences, the German countryside she had once believed was invincible. Her first full day in the infirmary brought more shocks. Breakfast arrived on metal trays, oatmeal, powdered milk, bread with butter, real butter, yellow and rich, coffee that tasted like coffee. A nurse, American but speaking decent German, explained the daily routine. Meals 3 times a day, medical rounds every morning and evening, physical therapy for those recovering from injuries, clean clothes provided, showers available. Showers. The word sent a chill through the German women in the infirmary. They had all heard the stories. Showers in camps meant something terrible, but when the time came, they were led to a tiled room where actual water, warm water, flowed from actual shower heads. Soap was provided, real soap, not the harsh lye chunks they had been using for years. Towels, clean and thick, waited on benches. Margarete stood under the warm water, one-armed and awkward with her splinted arm wrapped in waterproof covering, and cried. She wasn't sure why she was crying. Relief, maybe. Or confusion. or the overwhelming cognitive dissonance of being treated like a human being by people she had been taught were barely human themselves. The woman in the shower next to her was also crying, and the one beyond her. They all cried, letting the water wash away weeks of grime and fear and certainty. When they emerged, clean and clothed in simple camp dresses, they looked at each other with new eyes, like people waking from a nightmare to find the morning sun was real. Days became weeks. The routine of camp life settled into something almost normal. Margaret's arm healed slowly under the care of American doctors who checked it regularly, adjusted her splint, gave her exercises to maintain mobility. She learned the names of the nurses: Betty, who was from Ohio and had 3 brothers in the Pacific; Ruth, who was quiet but kind and sometimes smuggled extra cookies from the mess hall; Sarah, who spoke the best German and helped translate for those who knew no English. Each nurse had her own story, her own reasons for being here in defeated Germany. Betty talked about her brothers constantly, showed photographs of 3 young men in Navy uniforms, worried aloud about whether they would survive the Pacific War that still raged. Ruth had lost her fiancé at the Battle of the Bulge and rarely smiled, but her hands were gentle when changing bandages. Sarah's parents had emigrated from Germany in 1936, fleeing the regime, and she spoke German with a Berlin accent that reminded Margaret painfully of home. These women treated Margaret like a patient, not a war criminal. They asked about her pain levels, adjusted her medication, encouraged her to do her exercises even when it hurt. They brought her books in German from the camp library, mostly classics, Goethe and Schiller, pre-war authors who represented a Germany that seemed like a fever dream now. Had that Germany ever really existed? Or had the poison always been there, just hidden better? Margaret spent hours in the infirmary reading, her splinted arm propped on pillows, losing herself in words written in a time when her nation had produced poets instead of propaganda. The other patients in the infirmary became familiar. An older woman named Frau Weber, who had been a teacher before the war and now spent her days staring at the ceiling, silent and unreachable. A young girl, barely 18, named Christina, who cried every night for her mother in Hamburg. A former Wehrmacht nurse named Ilse, who was bitter and angry, refusing American treatment until infection forced her to accept it. Ilse became a strange mirror for Margaret. She watched the older woman cling to her hatred, even as American doctors saved her life, even as American nurses brought her food and medicine and comfort. Ilse would eat the food, but curse the hands that brought it, would accept treatment but spit at the nurses' backs, would heal physically while rotting spiritually, consumed by a rage that had nowhere left to go. "You're weak," Ilse hissed at Margaret one night, after seeing her thank Nurse Betty in English. "You've let them corrupt you. You smile at them. You learn their language. You've forgotten who you are." Margaret lay in her bed thinking about that accusation long into the night. Had she forgotten who she was, or was she finally discovering who she might become without the lies? The question had no easy answer. The food continued to baffle and shame her. Every meal was more than she had eaten in months back home. Breakfast meant oatmeal or eggs, bread with jam, coffee, or milk. Lunch brought sandwiches with actual meat, soup, fruit when available. Dinner was the fullest meal. Potatoes, vegetables, meat, sometimes dessert. The portions were generous. No one went hungry. The first time Margaret saw an apple in the mess hall, she almost cried. Apples had disappeared from German markets by 1943, hoarded or rotted or simply non-existent in a nation that had turned all its resources to war. This apple was red and perfect, sitting on her tray next to a sandwich she couldn't finish because her stomach had shrunk from years of near starvation. She held it in her good hand, feeling its weight, smelling its sweetness, and felt overwhelming shame. Her mother was eating grass soup. Her neighbors in Stuttgart were boiling tree bark for broth. And here she sat in an American camp with an apple, a sandwich, and coffee so rich it made her dizzy. The moral calculus was impossible. She had been the enemy. She had served the regime. She deserved punishment, not abundance. Yet here was abundance anyway, offered without condition, without cruelty, just offered. Some women refused to eat at first. 3 women in her barracks tried hunger strikes, attempting to maintain some dignity through rejection. But hunger is a powerful force, and American kindness was relentless. The guards didn't force-feed them or punish them. They simply left the food, fresh and plentiful, within reach. And eventually, inevitably, the women ate. They all ate. Because to refuse survival seemed noble only until you were actually starving. The mess hall became a place of quiet transformation. Margaret watched women who had entered the camp gaunt and hollow-eyed begin to fill out, to regain color, to look alive again. She watched it happen to herself in the small mirror above the infirmary sink. Her cheekbones were less sharp, her eyes less sunken. Her skin had color instead of that grayish tinge of malnutrition. The evidence of American care was written on her body, and she couldn't deny it or refuse it or explain it away. The camp even had a bakery, run by American army cooks who made fresh bread daily. The smell of it drifted across the camp every morning, yeast and warmth and normalcy. It reminded Margarete so powerfully of her father's bakery that she sometimes had to leave her barracks to escape the smell and the memories it brought. Her father had baked bread with love, with pride in his craft. These Americans baked bread for their enemies. There was a lesson in that, but she wasn't sure she wanted to learn it. One morning, a new prisoner arrived at the camp, a woman in her 50s who had been a party official's wife. She was arrogant still, demanding, insisting on special treatment. The Americans gave her the same treatment as everyone else: medical care, food, a bed, basic dignity. Nothing more, nothing less. Margarete watched this woman's certainty crumble over weeks, watched her realize that her status meant nothing here, that the Americans didn't care about her husband's rank or her party membership. They cared only that she was human and in need. That equality was revolutionary and terrifying. In the Reich, there had been hierarchy, important people and unimportant people, valuable lives and disposable ones. But here, in this American camp, the lowest-ranked auxiliary and the party official's wife got the same portions, the same care, the same basic respect. It was democracy in action, though Margarete didn't yet know the word for what she was witnessing. Margarete watched herself and the other women change. Their faces filled out. Color returned to cheeks that had been pale and hollow. Hair began to shine again instead of hanging lank and lifeless. Some of the women, the younger ones especially, started to laugh, to joke, to act like girls instead of soldiers. But this physical healing came with psychological torment. Letters from home began to arrive, passed through military censors, but still reaching them. Margarete received one from her mother in Stuttgart. The handwriting was shaky, the paper thin and cheap. Her mother wrote of starvation, of living in the rubble of their bombed house, of eating grass soup and potato peels. She wrote of neighbors dying from disease and hunger. She wrote asking if Margarete was alive, begging for any news. Margarete read the letter while eating a lunch of beef stew and fresh bread. The guilt was crushing. She was here, gaining weight, healing, warm and fed, while her mother starved in the ruins of a city Margarete had once called home. How could she write back? What could she possibly say? That she was comfortable? That the enemy fed her better than her own government ever had? That she had attacked an American medic and he had responded with kindness? She wasn't the only one struggling with this guilt. In the barracks at night, women whispered to each other about their families, their homes, the impossible contradiction of their situation. Some clung desperately to their old beliefs, insisting this American kindness was temporary, a trick, that the real punishment would come later. Others began to question everything they had been taught. "My brother died at Normandy," one woman said quietly one night. "He was 19. He believed in the Führer, in the cause, in the righteousness of our war. He died believing he was fighting for something noble. But look at us. Look at where we are and who is keeping us alive. What did he die for?" No one had an answer. The question hung in the air like smoke. Margarete kept David's photograph hidden in her pillowcase. At night, when she couldn't sleep, she would take it out and look at those American faces. The wife who was probably worrying about her husband. The children who were probably counting days until their father came home. These people were supposed to be her enemies. Yet their husband and father had saved her life, treated her wounds, given her chocolate and his family's picture. One afternoon the camp showed a film. It was newsreel footage from the liberation of concentration camps. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. The German women prisoners were required to watch. The American commandant wanted them to see what had been done in their nation's name. Margarete sat in the mess hall, converted into a movie theater, and watched skeletal figures in striped uniforms, mountains of corpses, gas chambers, crematoria, the evidence of systematic murder on a scale too vast to comprehend. Some women cried. Some covered their faces. Some sat stone-faced, refusing to believe. Some fainted. Margarete watched it all, forcing herself not to look away. She had heard rumors during the war, whispers about camps in the East, about what happened to Jews and political prisoners. But rumors were easy to dismiss, easy to rationalize as enemy propaganda. This was different. This was documented, filmed, undeniable. After the film, she vomited in the latrine. Then she sat on the floor and wept. For the victims, for her own willful blindness, for the betrayal of everything she had believed was good and right. She had worn the uniform, had served the regime, had believed in the cause, and all of it, every moment of certainty and pride, had been built on this foundation of horror. That night, she dreamed of David's wife and children. In the dream, they were among the skeletal figures in the camps. She woke screaming, tangled in her sheets, and couldn't go back to sleep. 6 weeks after arriving at the camp, Margarete's splint came off. Her arm was weak, the break still tender, but healed. The doctor, an American captain with gray hair and kind eyes, pronounced her recovery excellent. He gave her exercises to rebuild strength and flexibility. He spoke to her like a patient, not a prisoner, like a person. That same week, she was transferred from the infirmary to the general women's barracks. Here, the daily routine expanded. The women were assigned work details, nothing harsh, mostly cleaning, laundry, kitchen help. They were paid in camp script that could be used in the canteen for small luxuries: chocolate, cigarettes, soap, writing paper. The canteen itself was another shock. Shelves stocked with goods that hadn't been seen in Germany for years. The women could buy these things with their earned scrip. The Americans weren't starving them or working them to death. They were paying them, treating them like workers, not slaves. Margaret's work assignment was in the camp laundry. She worked alongside other German women, washing and ironing American uniforms and camp linens. The work was hot and tiring, but not brutal. The supervising American sergeant was a woman in her 30s named Helen, who spoke no German but communicated with gestures and patience. She brought them cold water on hot days, let them take breaks when they needed to, treated them like human beings doing a job, not enemies to be punished. The laundry was housed in a large building that had once been a German army warehouse. Inside, huge washing machines churned constantly, filled with uniforms and sheets and towels. The air was thick with steam and the smell of soap. Good soap, American soap that actually cleaned, instead of just redistributing the dirt like the lye chunks they had used during the war. Margarete and 5 other women worked the ironing section, pressing shirts and trousers with heavy irons heated on coal stoves. At first, the work crew was silent, each woman lost in her own thoughts and fears. But as days passed, they began to talk. Quietly at first, then more openly. They shared stories of their lives before the war, during the war, their hopes and fears for what came after. One woman, Greta, had been a seamstress in Munich. Another, Paula, had worked in a factory making radio components. They had been ordinary people doing ordinary jobs until the war swept them up and deposited them here, on the other side of defeat, ironing the conqueror's clothes. Sergeant Helen brought a radio into the laundry room one day. American music poured out, jazz and swing and sounds so different from the martial music that had dominated German radio for 12 years. At first, the women pretended not to listen, focusing on their work. But the music was infectious. It had joy in it, life, a freedom of sound that was almost dangerous. Margarete caught herself humming along one afternoon and stopped, horrified at herself. But then Greta started humming too, and Paula, and soon they were all working to the rhythm of enemy music, their hands moving in time with beats that had been forbidden. Sergeant Helen noticed and smiled, turning up the volume. She didn't speak German, but her message was clear. This is what peace sounds like. This is what you've been missing. Small kindnesses accumulated like drops filling a bucket. A young American soldier brought them chocolate bars one day, passing them out with a shy smile before hurrying away. An older officer, visiting the laundry to check on supplies, noticed Margarete favoring her healing arm and arranged for her workload to be lightened until she was fully recovered. Sergeant Helen learned to say good morning and thank you in German. Her pronunciation terrible, but her effort genuine. These small acts were harder to process than grand gestures would have been. Margarete could have dismissed elaborate kindness as propaganda, as manipulation designed to soften them for some later cruelty. But this casual, everyday decency was harder to deny. It was how these Americans treated everyone all the time. It was just who they were. One day, Margarete was ironing officers' shirts when she recognized one. The name tape read, Morrison, D. David Morrison, the medic who had treated her. She held the shirt carefully, running her fingers over the fabric, wondering where he was now, if he was safe, if his wife and children had him back yet, or if he was still treating wounded soldiers somewhere in the chaos of post-war Europe. She ironed that shirt with more care than she had given anything in months, pressed every seam perfectly, made sure not a wrinkle remained. It was a small thing, meaningless really, but it felt important, a tiny repayment for the kindness he had shown when she had deserved none. As summer progressed, the camp received new privileges. A small library was established, stocked with German books collected from nearby towns. On Sunday afternoons, the women were allowed to use a courtyard for recreation. Some played cards, some wrote letters, some just sat in the sun, faces tilted upward, soaking in warmth and peace. Margarete often sat alone during these recreation periods, watching the other women, thinking about everything that had changed. She was 23 years old and her entire worldview had collapsed. Everything she had been taught about superiority, about the rightness of their cause, about the evil of their enemies, it was all lies. Not just wrong, but deliberately, systematically false. The Americans weren't perfect. She saw that too. Some guards were cold, distant, clearly hating having to watch over Germans. Some officers were harsh, their orders sharp and unforgiving. But even at their worst, they operated within rules. Geneva Convention rules that protected prisoners, fed them, housed them, didn't torture or murder them. The contrast with what she had seen in the liberation footage haunted her. The camps her nation had built operated by different rules. No rules. Where prisoners were worked to death, starved deliberately, gassed en masse. The moral gap between her captivity and that reality was a chasm she couldn't cross. One Sunday afternoon in July, sitting in the recreation yard with the sun warm on her face, Margarete made a decision. She went to the camp education office, a small building where Americans taught English classes and civics lessons to prisoners who wanted to learn. She asked in her halting English if she could attend the classes. The officer in charge, Lieutenant Peters, looked surprised but pleased. "You want to learn English?" he asked in German. "I want to understand," Margarete replied. "I want to understand why. Why you are kind when you could be cruel. Why you feed us when we are your enemies. Why any of this?" She gestured around at the camp, at the impossible reality of her comfortable captivity. Lieutenant Peters studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Classes start Monday evening," he said. "You're welcome to join." The classes were held in a room with chairs arranged in a circle, about 15 German prisoners and 2 American instructors. They learned English vocabulary and grammar, yes, but also American civics. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, concepts of democracy, individual liberty, equality before law, ideas that had been mocked and dismissed in German schools for 12 years. Margarete absorbed it all like someone dying of thirst. The idea that government derived its power from the consent of the governed, not from force. That individuals had rights that couldn't be taken away by the state. That all people were created equal, regardless of race or religion or nation. These concepts were revolutionary to her, dangerous, and desperately, achingly attractive. Lieutenant Peters, the main instructor, was a former high school teacher from Massachusetts who had volunteered for this duty specifically. He believed in education as redemption, in the power of ideas to overcome indoctrination. He was patient with their struggles, firm but never cruel, always willing to explain concepts again and again until they understood. "In America," he explained in slow, clear German, "we believe that no person is better than another just because of where they were born or who their parents were. We believe that everyone deserves certain rights, to speak freely, to practice their religion, to have a fair trial. These rights don't come from government. They exist because you're human." A woman in the class, former Hitler Youth leader named Heidi, challenged him. "But what about order? What about national strength? If everyone is equal, how can anything be accomplished? Don't you need leaders, hierarchy, discipline?" "We have leaders," Peters replied calmly. "But our leaders serve the people, not the other way around. And if they fail to serve the people, we can remove them through elections. Power flows upward from citizens, not downward from rulers. That's the difference." These debates filled their class time. The German women, raised on certainty and hierarchy, struggled with concepts that seemed designed to create chaos. But they also began to see the results of these concepts. America was strong, not despite democracy, but because of it. The soldiers guarding them believed in what they were fighting for, not because they feared punishment for disagreement, but because they actually believed. That kind of strength was different from the forced compliance they had known. Margarete started reading American newspapers that the camp library provided. The Stars and Stripes mostly, but sometimes civilian papers from home that soldiers had finished with. She read about debates in Congress, about criticism of President Truman, about protests and arguments and people publicly disagreeing with their government without fear of arrest. It was dizzying. In Germany, such dissent had meant concentration camps. Here, it was normal, expected, protected. "How can a nation survive when people constantly argue?" she asked Peters one day after class. He smiled. "That argument is how we survive. When people can disagree openly, bad ideas get challenged, mistakes get corrected, truth has a chance to emerge. It's messy and loud and frustrating, but it works better than silence enforced by fear." She thought about the silence in Germany during the war years, the whispered conversations, the fear of informants, the way people had stopped saying what they really thought and only repeated what was safe. That silence had let horrors grow unchecked. Maybe Peters was right. Maybe the noise of freedom was better than the quiet of oppression. She practiced her English with the nurses in the infirmary when she went for her arm checkups, practiced with the guards who were willing to chat during work breaks. Slowly, haltingly, she began to communicate not just in their language, but in their ideas, to think in concepts that had been forbidden. 3 months into her captivity, Margarete finally wrote back to her mother. She had put it off for so long because she didn't know what to say, how to explain what she was experiencing without sounding like she had gone insane or betrayed everything they had believed. In the end, she tried to be honest. She wrote about her broken arm and how it had been treated, about the food and the shelter, about the kindness that confused her, about the concentration camp footage that had shattered her, about the classes she was taking and the ideas she was learning. She wrote that she didn't know what to believe anymore, but that she was beginning to think they had been wrong about many things. The letter took 3 weeks to reach Stuttgart, and 3 weeks for a reply to return. When it came, her mother's response was brief and devastating. She wrote that Margarete had become a traitor, that she had been corrupted by enemy propaganda, that it would be better if she had died than become this thing she was now. The letter ended with a single line: "You are no longer my daughter." Margarete read it 3 times, each reading cutting deeper. Then she folded it carefully and put it away. She cried, but not as much as she expected. Part of her had known this would be the response. Part of her had already mourned the loss of the family she used to have, the beliefs she used to hold, the certainty that used to guide her. That night, she took out David's photograph again. The American family smiling at the camera. She wondered if they knew what their husband and father had done for a German enemy, if they would be proud or horrified. She suspected they would be proud. That was the difference she was beginning to understand. The difference between a society that valued all human life and one that valued only its own. Autumn came. The trees around the camp turned gold and red. The air grew crisp. Rumors began to circulate about repatriation, that prisoners would soon be sent back to Germany, to occupied zones administered by Allied forces. The prospect filled Margarete with complicated dread. Germany was destroyed, divided, occupied. Going back meant returning to starvation and ruins. But more than that, it meant returning to people who still believed the lies, who would see her transformation not as growth, but as betrayal, who would hate her for the very things she was beginning to value most. In her English class, Lieutenant Peters assigned them an essay. They were to write about what democracy meant to them, in their own words, in English. It was a challenging assignment. The vocabulary was difficult, the concepts even more so. But Margarete worked on it for days, writing and rewriting, using a German-English dictionary until her head hurt. Her final essay was simple, grammatically imperfect, but honest. She wrote, "Democracy means the enemy can be kind. Democracy means all people have value, not only our people. Democracy means I can be wrong and learn to be right. Democracy means I am not my nation, I am myself. Democracy means I can change." Lieutenant Peters read it aloud in class, translating the imperfect English for those still struggling with the language. When he finished, the room was quiet. Some of the German women looked uncomfortable. A few looked angry, but several were crying, nodding, understanding exactly what Margarete meant. "This," Lieutenant Peters said quietly, "is what we're fighting for. Not to destroy you, but to help you find this understanding, this freedom to change." The repatriation orders came in November 1945. The women would be transported to the American occupation zone in southern Germany, processed through displaced persons camps, and eventually released to find their way home or to whatever remained of their lives. On her last day at the camp, Margarete was called to the commandant's office. She went nervously, unsure what she had done or what was wanted. But when she arrived, she found not the commandant, but David, the medic who had treated her broken arm 6 months ago, who had shown her his family's photograph, who had started the long process of breaking through her hatred. He stood when she entered, smiling that same tired but genuine smile. "Margarete," he said in his careful German, "I heard you were leaving tomorrow. I wanted to say goodbye." She stared at him, overwhelmed. "You came back," she managed in English, "just to say goodbye?" "I wanted to see how your arm healed," he said, "and to give you something." He held out an envelope. Inside was a letter of reference, written in English and German, stating that Margarete Hoffmann had been a model prisoner who had worked diligently in the camp laundry, attended educational classes, and shown remarkable personal growth. It was signed by David Morrison, by Lieutenant Peters, by the camp commandant. It was a document that might help her find work in occupied Germany, that testified to her character, that gave her a future beyond her past. Margaret's eyes blurred with tears. "Why?" she asked. "After I attacked you, after everything, why do you keep being kind to me?" David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you were scared and hurt, and you had been lied to your whole life, and because kindness is stronger than hate. My wife taught me that. She always said that responding to fear with more fear just creates more fear, but responding to it with understanding, that's how you break the cycle." He paused, then added softly, "Also because I have a daughter. She's about your age now. And I keep thinking, what if she had been born somewhere else, taught different things, caught up in something terrible? I would hope that if she needed help, someone would show her kindness too." Margarete couldn't speak. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the photograph he had given her 6 months ago. The picture of his wife and children. "I kept it," she said. "I looked at it every day. It helped me remember that you were real, that kindness was real." David smiled. "Keep it," he said. "Consider it a reminder. When you go back to Germany, you're going to face a lot of anger and pain and people who still believe the old lies. You'll need reminders that there's another way to live." They talked for another hour. David told her about his home in Pennsylvania, about his work as a pharmacist before the war, about his hope to return to that quiet life soon. Margarete told him about Stuttgart, about her father's bakery, about her dream of maybe opening a bakery herself someday, using the skills her father had taught her before the war destroyed everything. When it was time for him to leave, they shook hands. Then, impulsively, Margarete hugged him, the enemy who had saved her, the American who had shown her humanity when she had been drowning in hatred. David hugged her back briefly, then stepped away. "Good luck, Margarete," he said. "I think you're going to be okay. You're stronger than you know." "Thank you," she replied in English. "For everything. For my life." Margarete Hoffmann returned to Germany in December 1945. She found Stuttgart in ruins, her family's bakery a pile of rubble, her mother still alive but barely, living in a basement with 3 other families. Their reunion was cold. Her mother never forgave her for what she saw as betrayal. They lived in the same city but rarely spoke. Margarete used her letter of reference to find work with the American Occupation Administration, first as a translator, then as a liaison helping to rebuild German civil infrastructure. She worked hard, saved carefully, and in 1948 opened a small bakery in Stuttgart's slowly recovering center. She named it Hoffmann's, after her father. She never married, never had children of her own. But she became known in her neighborhood for kindness to those in need, for hiring people others wouldn't, former prisoners, displaced persons, anyone willing to work hard regardless of their past. When asked why she did this, she would simply say, "Someone was kind to me once when I didn't deserve it. I'm just passing it forward." She kept David's photograph on a shelf in her bakery for the rest of her life. Customers sometimes asked about it. She would tell them it was a reminder that enemies could choose to be human, that hatred could be overcome, that even in the darkest times, kindness could break through. In 1968, 23 years after the war ended, Margarete received a letter from America. It was from David Morrison's daughter, now grown and married herself. Her father had passed away the previous year, the letter explained, and while going through his things, she had found a diary from the war. In it, he had written about a German woman named Margarete who had attacked him out of fear, and about how helping her heal had reminded him of the importance of choosing compassion over revenge. David's daughter wanted Margarete to know that her father had often spoken of her, that she had been an example he used when teaching his children about the power of kindness to change hearts. She enclosed a photograph of David in his later years, smiling, surrounded by grandchildren. Margarete wept over that letter. She wrote back, telling David's daughter the full story of what her father had done, how he had saved not just her arm but her soul, how he had shown her that there was a better way to live than the hatred she had been taught. They corresponded for years after that. 2 women from different worlds connected by one man's decision to respond to fear with kindness. Margarete lived to be 81 years old. When she died in 1999, her bakery was still operating, now run by employees she had trained. In her will, she left everything to a foundation supporting reconciliation programs between former enemies. And she left instructions that 2 photographs should be buried with her, the picture of David's family that he had given her in 1945, and the picture of him as an old man, surrounded by the grandchildren who existed because he had chosen compassion over hatred. The story of Margarete Hoffmann and David Morrison is true. Their names have been changed to protect their family's privacy, but the events are documented in military records, personal diaries, and the letters they exchanged over decades. What happened between them in May 1945 was not unique. Across Europe, in hundreds of POW camps, similar moments played out. Enemy soldiers choosing humanity over hatred, prisoners discovering that the monsters they had been taught to fear were just people, flawed and tired and trying to do the right thing. These small acts of kindness, multiplied across thousands of encounters, helped break the cycle of revenge that might have poisoned post-war Europe for generations. The chocolate bar David shared, the photograph of his family, the patient way he sat after being attacked showing no anger, only concern. These weren't grand gestures, they were simple acts of human decency. But they had the power to shatter hatred because hatred requires dehumanization. Once you see the enemy as human, as a father, a son, someone who carries pictures of loved ones and wants to go home, the hatred begins to crack. Margarete often told her employees, especially those who had also lived through the war, "I attacked kindness because I was afraid of it. Kindness is more dangerous to hatred than any weapon, a weapon you can defend against. But kindness? Kindness gets through all your defenses and shows you that everything you believed was wrong." Today, in a world that often seems divided by the same old hatreds, the same old certainties about who is good and who is evil, Margarete's story reminds us of something crucial, that change is possible, that people raised on lies can learn truth, that enemies can become friends, that a single act of unexpected kindness can break through years of propaganda and fear. The scratch Margarete gave David's cheek healed within a week. The change she underwent took much longer. But both healings happened because one person chose compassion over revenge, understanding over judgment, humanity over hatred. If this story moved you, if it made you think about how we treat those we've been taught to hate, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We share these forgotten stories of World War II because they hold lessons that every generation needs to learn. That kindness is stronger than hate, that change is possible, and that seeing the humanity in our enemies might be the bravest thing we ever do. Thank you for listening to Margarette's story. Thank you for remembering that, behind every uniform, every flag, every side, and every conflict, there are just people, capable of terrible things, yes, but also capable of learning, changing, and choosing a better way.